Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the producers panel. And I need to thank UGG, our presenting sponsor. And and you guys are in for quite a treat. Incredible ensemble of the best producers working in cinema today. And before we introduce them all, let's watch clips from all the nominated films represented, and then we'll introduce the panelists, which I'll tell you who they are. Is Graham Broadbent, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Lisa Bruce, Darkest Hour. Peter Spears, Call Me By Your Name. Miles Dale, The Shape of Water. Daniel Lupi, The Phantom Thread. Shan McKittrick, Get Out. Evelyn O'Neill, Lady Bird. And Emma Thomas, Dunkirk. So let's watch the clips. So please welcome Emma Thomas, producer, Dunkirk. Peter Spears, Call Me By Your Name. Evelyn O'Neill, Lady Bird. Sean McKittrick, Get Out. Daniel Lupi, Phantom Thread. J. Miles Dale, The Shape of Water. Lisa Bruce, Darkest Hour. And Graham Broadbent, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And please also welcome your moderator, Los Angeles Times columnist and writer, Glenn Whipp.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you guys here again for this festival. I know the region's gone through some hard times, and so thank you so much for coming out and supporting this event and supporting the festival. And thank you guys for coming this morning. So producers, I was reading a book about the industry. It was written by a couple of screenwriters, so what do they know, right? But here's how they described the job of producer. They said, most movie producers are crazy because being a movie producer is a job that no sane person would want. As far as we can tell, no sane person has had the job yet and succeeded at it anyway. So my first question to you guys is that a pretty true description? Am I up here dealing with just a bunch of crazy people? Just
I don't know. I personally think I love my job, and I don't think I suppose it takes a certain amount of, I think grit rather than craziness.
I think we wrangle crazy more than we're crazy.
I was being diplomatic.
I think you have to be fairly obsessed in order to ride the marathon, and I think obsession is sort of a close cousin to nutty, a little crazy, right. So sure.
Okay.
There was no job for me in the straight world, so it was all that I had left.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you. We'll get to know each of you, each of your films, test your sanity levels, and then move on to some kind of broader questions about what's going on in the industry right now. Peter, you're at LA Film Critics Center, and we were just talking about this. Your journey, you've spent like 20 years as a writer, actor, director. You're saying when you first arrived in LA, you were living on Olympic Boulevard in a closet, literally and figuratively.
It's true, yes.
And here you are on the stage, Oscar-nominated producer. It's an amazing journey.
It is, it's an unlikely journey. I will say, having been an actor, actors are the craziest, not producers. And all the producers here will probably agree that that's true as well. So I'm happy to be with a lot saner people. Yeah, it was, I mean, my journey in particular has been a long journey to here. And the movie, our movie in particular, has been a 10-year journey since the time that we optioned the book originally and when it first came out. So, you know, it was really a matter of trying to find the right combination of not just, you know, actors and directors and that's part of it, but also just the right people to bring on board. It really ultimately took a sort of a global effort of producers, from Luca himself, the filmmaker, who's an amazing producer, and his producing partner, Marco, from Italy, and our producing partners from France and from Brazil, and Howard Roseman, a longtime producer from Hollywood. And all of us sort of finally, a few years ago when we finally all got together to do, or a couple years ago now, to make this movie, it finally clicked, and sort of all the long time no's and what ifs, and why does your movie not have higher stakes, and could the mother be more evil, and could somebody, you know, could somebody get sick even though, you know, and maybe die, you know, which we heard from financiers and people all along the way. Finally, we had the right group who just said, we want to tell this story because the story was, you know, the stakes of the heart felt as high as any kind of stakes you could tell, and ultimately was, you know, just what drove finally this across the finish line to get it made a decade later.
So, I mean, even though you're adapting a really beloved novel, that's just held so close to the heart for so many people, you have people asking you, well, yeah, can't you insert this? Can't you do this? Can't you change this, making the stakes quote unquote higher?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of amazing what people will, and the things you actually think about, you might actually consider doing because you're so desperate to make the movie.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay, I guess yes, the mother could maybe, you know, put her cigarette out on the back of his hand at some point or something like that. If that, you know, if that'll give us another $1 million, you know, sure. But, you know, but because the book was so beloved and because so many people felt, I mean, the second the book came out, it was immediately heralded as a classic of queer cinema, and beyond queer literature. And beyond that is what, I mean, you know, it was almost universally loved. So you did have that responsibility to, and I had talked Andre into, like, you know, I'm just a schmuck. I'm like, hey, well, are you going to give me the rights to your book? You know, what have you done? He asked. You know, it's like, I haven't done anything, but I promise you I'm going to make the best possible movie of this book. And because he believed in us, we just felt like at the end of the day, we owed this to him, and owed it to be a beautiful companion piece to his book. And it does diverge. I mean, the book and the movie are not 100% similar. But he loves the ways in which it's different, and the ways in which it's different is I think the wizardry of Luca, and what Luca brought to the equation, and where it became, you know, a uniquely Luca Guadagnino film, and his book is a uniquely Andre Aciman book, and the two feel like a really great marriage, I think, ultimately.
Lucas talked a lot about making a sequel to this.
Yes.
I mean, is that something that you think is going to happen?
You know, I would do anything. I would go anywhere with Luca to do anything, and I never would have thought originally that the adaptation he made of this book would look ultimately like the one he made. So, you know, and the book itself has about a third of the book is still not addressed in the movie. So there's some stuff there. But the ways he's been talking and thinking in his mind about it are so fascinating, and I think, you know, that who knows what the gods of cinema will ultimately, what will ultimately happen. I don't have another 10 years to do it, you know, like, you know, if it could happen and it's quicker, then that would be great. But it would also be great for the actors to get older and to have that happen as well. So the answer is I don't know, but with Luca, the experience is always an amazing one, whatever he's doing, and it would be an honor to get to work with him again.
And one of the reasons it took a little while to make this is that you could only shoot it in Italy in the summer. So if you missed that window,
That's
then
right.
another year would have to roll by before
Yeah, that
you
happened
do
a
it.
lot. And, we just have to get on the runway again. And finally, when we were ready to shoot, in 2016, we got to Italy. And as I may have mentioned before, but it was the wettest, coldest, rainiest summer in 200 years in Europe. So everything you see up there is the amazing work of our cinematographer and our director together. And actors putting ice cubes in their mouths between takes so you don't see their breath when they're talking, and being in like wetsuits, from the bottom down in the lakes and in rivers, and lakes were flooded, and we had to change locations, and constantly, I think there's several people here who've dealt with like a lot of weather problems at this time when we were making movies in that spring, summer of 2016. But so we waited 10 years for summer in Italy and might as well have been shooting in Seattle or something.
That is such an amazing story, and I didn't really know that, and I didn't really know that until I was prepping for this. Because if you watch this movie, it's just like the most beautiful, idyllic summer, and I hear this story about spitting out ice cubes in between takes so you don't see the actor's breath, and I got to watch this movie again now.
Absolutely. I'm ready to go back to Italy and have real summer.
A real summer, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we have a couple of producers here who have had long professional partnerships with their spouses. Daniel, you've been with Paul Thomas Anderson since the very beginning, Hard Eight, and your wife, Joanne, came on board with Boogie Nights, his next film. So you guys have been working with Paul 20 years. How has your relationship with Paul changed over the years?
I think part of it it was keeping the professional side away from the social side. So we very much have a relationship with Paul as the director, which has lasted. So it's. He's changed a lot. He's certainly become, from his beginning, from Boogie Nights, he was far more. He'd shot list, and we would. Now it's become far more organic. In his films now it tends to be an ever-changing process, which works well for him. Mm-hmm. But it's, it's pretty great. It's lasted 20 years. Although Joanne and I a lot of times keep going, all right, will this be the last one? And I guess it hasn't been yet.
Well, with this one, you got him to go to England too.
He came up with the idea. It's actually funny because Paul basically has made all his films in the Valley.
Right.
I come from West London and my wife's from North London, and I know more about the Valley than probably people who come from a valley. And so he started writing. He was like, I think I'm going to make another film with Daniel Day-Lewis, and this was a couple of years ago. And then suddenly he's like, I think it's going to be in London, and we were like, really? So it was. He drove it to London, and I think it was a good experience shooting in the UK.
Was it nice for you to be working with?
Yeah, it was. Look, England. Emma will attest. It's quite different in England. In England, it tends to be more structured. People like to work 12-hour days. Actually, now they actually like to work 10-hour days. But with Paul is a director where he'll do 10, 20 takes, maybe more. So a lot of the times, we'll shoot, 14, 15 hours a day. So going to England actually was interesting. Look, the English crews are great. American crews tend to be, their life becomes the movie. In England, the crews tend to have a life also. So like on a Friday, so like on a Friday night, you'll be shooting late, and you'll be like, okay, we need to go till midnight, and then the gaffer or whoever will come to you and go, no.
Or if the football's on.
Correct.
Right?
I mean, no, it's
And when they say that, there's really no response. Is what you're saying.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But anyway,
You
it's
Pack
yes,
it up and see you on Monday.
Exactly.
Right. You mentioned that he had told you that he was writing something with Daniel and mine, or he had something. He and Daniel Day-Lewis have been trying or been talking about making another movie together for some time after There Will Be Blood, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
But this particular one very much was a collaboration of Daniel Day-Lewis and Paul. You know, Daniel Day-Lewis was very much involved in the story, and regards, you know, they both added a lot to
So
it.
when Paul was writing the story, he was talking.
In total,
Yeah.
yes. You know, he was going to Ireland and going to New York, and yes.
I mean, it's such a beautiful movie and performance. Interesting that, I mean, he's so famous for also, you know, immersing himself in the characters, I guess, to the point, I mean, do you believe that he's not going to make another movie? Daniel
yes.
Day-Lewis? Yeah?
Yes. I mean, it's the third film I've done with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
And he puts such commitment into the roles that I'm sure it's quite draining. You know, I mean, he's in that character for, you know, like a year.
Right.
And he, you know, he doesn't break out of it. You know, he comes to work as Reynolds Woodcock, and he leaves as Reynolds Woodcock. So it's probably a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe even for you as a producer.
Yes,
With that character, yeah. You
Which-
know, right?
it's hard to have a conversation with the actor.
Emma, you have been making movies with your husband, Christopher Nolan, since the beginning. In fact, Following was the first. You guys self-financed that movie, his first. Can you tell me how you came up with the money for that movie?
Well, actually, we even go back longer than that, because we met at university and we started. I had never even imagined film producing. I had no idea what that looked like. I just, you know, where he had always known that he wanted to direct films, and we met in our halls of residence, and he, you know, I ended up in the Film Society, and sort of I started producing films for him without really even knowing what it was I was doing. I was just helping out, you know. I was just sort of there. So we made a lot of short films first, but then after we'd left university, I was actually working for Working Title and in London, and he was doing some camera work for media training. But he very clearly had this feature film that he wanted to make. He'd written the script, and he'd actually very carefully sort of thought about how he wanted to make it for no money, and had figured out how to shoot it so it didn't look as though it was made for no money. And we had this, you know, we had jobs, we had to keep working in order to pay for the film. And so we knew we were only going to be able to make, you know, shoot on weekends. And so he'd conceived of the whole script really knowing that. Like, it had a disjointed timeline, primarily because we knew that continuity was going to be an issue. You know, it was black and white because he knew that he could only really make it look good black and white. You know, we had actually tried to make a previous feature film, which we had acted in, which that was a no-go. But it also, we shot it in color, and the color just sort of betrayed the low, but it just didn't look, we could never make it look professional enough, you know, with the lack of money that we had. So Following was very much the result of a sort of process of figuring out what we could and couldn't do and maximizing our resources. And so, yeah, so we paid for it with, you know, the money we earned in the week, and it cost $6,000. I mean, you know,
Right.
there was a very small group of our friends who made it with us. The equipment was free because we were still using our university's equipment, yeah, it was a great experience, and we're happily still friends with all the friends that we made that film with, it was the beginning.
Yeah. You're in a very different situation now.
Kind of. I mean, the funny thing is that in many ways the process has not changed that much. The films that we make, even though they are, I think, on the face of it, very large in scope and scale, they feel like kind of a cottage industry in a way. There's on the last few films, it's really only been me and Chris producing them. We have a very sort of small and tight group of crew who we work with, again and again. And in many ways, the way Chris directs, he sort of approaches the films as independent films. There's not a huge amount of stuff on set. We don't have a video village. We have, it's all very small and low key. And I think that as the process has evolved, we're almost stripping things away more than we are adding. We're sort of streamlining, and so in many ways it doesn't feel that different.
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking, and I interviewed Chris too, when you guys are talking about pitching a movie to Warner Brothers, you would think, your movies have made, I think, more than $5 billion worldwide. So how much, when you're making a pitch to Warner Brothers, who you've worked with over the years, how much convincing is really required to sell them on a film?
Well, I always think that they're in a terrible position when we take a project to them, because it's very hard for them to say no at this point to Chris. And so, but the good news about us, Chris, I think, and for them is, he has no interest in making a film that doesn't work for an audience, because ultimately that's the way he approaches films. He approaches them as sort of, what would it be like to watch this film? He also has we both very clearly want to continue working, and we have no desire to do anything stupid, frankly. And so Dunkirk, I think, was an extremely risky film for Warner Brothers. I think the approach that Chris took was experimental, to say the least. It's almost a silent film in many ways. There's not a great deal of plot. There's no particular, there's not a huge amount of dialogue. And so on. But at the same time, because of that, we asked them for a lot less money than we usually have. We made it for half the budget that Interstellar was made for example. And obviously it's an enormous amount of money for that film, but we were being as responsible as we could be, knowing that we wanted to make money for the studio. And we also have no interest in working with a studio that doesn't get what it is that we're doing, because then they can't market it. They can't, we need them to be as invested in the film as we are. And so the pitch process is we're really trying to get them on board, and we're really trying to explain to them what we value about the story. And as I say, we need them to be as excited about it as we are.
Yeah, I love just your conscientiousness, because I don't know that people who have had the success that you guys have had would have that sense, but you do. It really comes through talking to him as well. And with Dunkirk, you had a couple of personal connections to this. It's before you were married, right? You were on some kind of channel crossing from hell.
Yes, well, it's interesting, because one of the friends that helped us make Following, he also was an avid sailor, and he had a small a little ship himself that we would pootle around the coast of England on weekends through our college years and beyond. But then one year he was like, well, let's be a bit more ambitious. Let's go to Dunkirk. And it was Easter weekend, and we were like, fantastic, that'll be great. We had, I think, much the same idea of what that journey was going to look like as you had of Italy in the summer. It did not turn out to be as pleasant as we had imagined. It was truly one of the I think that to say that we were scarred by the experiences. I feel bad for our friend Ivan saying that, because it makes him sound like a bad sailor. He's not at all. He's a brilliant sailor. But it definitely, it really, when you're English, you know the story of the evacuation of Dunkirk. Everybody knows it. But the experience of this terrible crossing that we made really brought home for us what that really looked like, what that really meant. And so, it sort of was the seed that then led to the film. And I'm happy to say that then Ivan, our friend with the boat, we then had him come and be an extra on the days when we shot the little ships, and he's in the movie, and he was actually hugely helpful because a lot of the people who own those little ships don't take them out. You know, they're very careful with them, understandably, and they're not necessarily huge boating experts. And Ivan was able to actually fix one of them, and it was amazing.
And you'd also given Chris, and it sounds like you do this from time to time, given him a book of firsthand accounts of Dunkirk, people who were there. So you give him books. And
I do.
Say,
I often give him books
what
and talk to him
books
about
have you
things.
given him lately?
Oh, I can't say. I'm still lobbying hard for quite a few. I mean, I give him books all the time, and mostly he's like, "Oh, that's interesting," but no. This was the first time I think I gave him this book, reminded him of the story, and he really saw something that he could do with it. Yeah, I gave him another book last week, but not getting anywhere yet, but I'm trying.
Well, he says the secret to your partnership is that I do everything she says and never argue, and we don't bring our work home.
And I'd what?
And we don't bring our work home.
Okay, he's mad. He is mad. I would say that I think he absolutely argues. I mean, we argue with each other. It is a great working relationship because I think that, as you know, Daniel can probably speak to, when you work with somebody for as long as Chris and I have worked together, and Joanne and Daniel have worked with Paul, the relationship is one of trust. There's no, you understand that the other person either doesn't have an agenda, or if they do, you understand what their agenda is. And in my case, it's usually, we've got, I don't know, something with the kids on. We've got to get going. I think that we absolutely take our work home, and I think we take our work home far too much, probably. I don't think, we can't separate the social and the work. It's all. But our kids are part of it too. I think they get a bit fed up with probably how much work comes home, but at the same time they kind of love it too and like being a part of it. And it's not perfect because of that, but it works.
Good. A couple of you have produced movies with people who are known for being actors, for being performers, but they'd also long wanted to direct. Sean, you worked with Jordan Peele on Get Out, and he had wanted to direct for the longest time. So you had met him, you had been working with Keegan-Michael Key on a movie, Hell Baby, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, you got to meet Jordan Peele. He's got some ideas. So you guys went out to coffee, and was he just like pitching you some ideas for movies?
He was pitching me Get Out.
He was pitching?
Yeah.
And he said, here's one no one will make.
Yep. And then he pitched here's one that no one will ever make, but I have to get it off my chest. And he pitched it, and we bought it at the table. Just because I've never seen that movie before, and it was exciting. And at that point, he never unveiled to me his intention that he wanted to direct it. It was literally just a screenplay deal. So we paid him to write the screenplay, and he was doing back-to-back seasons of Key and Peele, the last 2 seasons. So it was taking a little while. And he said, I'm halfway through the script, I think I need to direct it. And so I hung up the phone, and I called my business partner who was going to finance this film. And he said, well, what do you think? I'm like, I've been sitting here for 10 minutes. I don't think there's a person on the planet other than Jordan who can direct this. Because it's a singular voice. It's a very difficult tone to kind of keep all these genres going. So I called him back and said, great, you're directing it.
Yeah.
And made his directing deal. And that was 2 months later, the script was done.
Do you think he always knew he wanted to direct it, but it was just kind of a thing where he had to
He did,
mentally...
but I think he needed to build his own confidence to admit it to himself that he was the right person to direct it. I don't think he had the confidence to say it yet. So.
Because now, like you say, you can't imagine anyone else directing that movie.
No, it was, I mean, the mistake I made is we kept trying to get him to play Rod.
Ha, right.
And you know, at that point he was already directing it, and he just said, no one will take it seriously. And if the moment they see my face, they're going to think it's just a comedy. And and this was long before we even had a casting reading for that role. But then, of course, he found Lil Rel, who was amazing.
Yeah. And you also you produced Donnie Darko. So you're kind of the master of making movies out of scripts that no one thinks can ever be made into movies.
Well, I wouldn't say master.
I did.
I enjoy making films that are challenging and I haven't seen before. That's what excites me. And, you know, like every film up here, these were not easy movies to make. These weren't, you know, big studio Marvel movies. You know, these are tough films to make, and that's what's exciting about it, and that's what kind of keeps me going.
Yeah. I imagine I mean, Get Out premiered last year at Sundance. So it's been more than a year. It arrived in theaters the weekend that Moonlight won Best Picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'll be more than a year, this year's Oscars. I mean, it's crazy and very, I think, very encouraging to see a movie like that nominated for Best Picture because it recognizes the value in genre filmmaking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's, you know, the movie had to be sold as a horror film to get butts and seats, but it's, you know, the horror I grew up with, you know, would be known as thrillers now, really. I mean, Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives, these are all like, that was my horror growing up, and horror evolved over the years and kind of to the slasher kind of torture porn type horror. So it gets a bad rap. Those aren't my favorite films. I mean, some of them are made very well, but and I think people are still talking about it because of what's going on in the world and what it kind of unveiled. It made it okay to speak about the fact that, you know, racism still exists. It's still everywhere. It's not, oh, we had a black president, it's all gone.
Right.
You know, and that's Jordan's response to that, just knowing it never went away. And I think that's why we're still part of the conversation, because people are still talking about it. The film made it okay to talk about some difficult stuff.
Yeah, it's easier. You can talk about race by talking about Get Out.
Exactly.
You know, it's an entry into the conversation. Evelyn Greta Gerwig had long wanted to direct too. I mean, she was telling me that she would just start saying it in interviews like a couple of years ago or so, yeah, I'm going to direct, just to hold herself accountable to finally write and direct this movie. And she had never done it before. You'd never produced before.
No.
You were her manager.
Yes.
So she came to you and basically said, well, I've never done this. You've never done this. But I think together we can do it.
It was a long germinating plan because when I met her and we decided to work together, it was sort of a low point in her trajectory. It was after the ill-fated Arthur. And it was pretty evident that the business didn't understand who she was. And yet everything that's magical about her was right there. You know, her charisma, her gifts as an actress, and her voice and her joy in life and her joy in movies. It was all right there. So it was a journey from that to this that involved co-writing Frances Ha and co-writing Mistress America and going through those 2 movies with Noah and really seeing everything that he did. But it was all about this launch of her own voice and her own independent vision.
How, when she gave you the script for this movie to read for the first time, how long was it?
I did not see the famous 350. She would sort of allude, I'm working on this project, it's about Sacramento, it's long, maybe it's a mini series, I don't know. I'd say, can I read it, can I read it? And she was like, no. And when she finally gave it to me, it was long, but very much in its current form, very much.
Because it's 94 minutes long, the final film.
She and Nick Huey, our brilliant editor, were ruthless
Yeah.
in the way they cut it.
Yeah, but there's a real economy to it, but you feel like even though some characters in the movie have a couple of scenes, each of them feels like they're fully realized characters.
They all existed in her head, and in the 350-page version apparently had their own stories, but she wanted every actor, and maybe that comes from the actor's perspective, to understand that the part of them you saw in the movie was just a peek at this entire three-dimensional thing that existed for that character.
Mm-hmm.
Every character had a playlist, every character had a story. I think it was really a treat for people, even in some of the smaller roles, to have something that was that
So
fleshed out.
you and Greta take this movie out, and you trying to find financing for it. It's a coming-of-age story, which we see a ton of. That genre is very well represented, but not so many coming-of-age stories about an assertive young woman finding her voice, and not so many coming-of-age stories that feature a central relationship between a mother and a daughter. What was the response when you're going to mostly men to look for money?
We didn't take it to very many people because we were concerned that they weren't going to understand it and protect it, and that we were going to go through the process that Peter has described of all the things they would want us to change. So we were very, very protective of it, and we selected a very small number of financiers who we thought would get it. And we were very, very lucky that Scott came along. He was not one of those financiers. We were embroiled in the, can you cut it? Can you shoot it in Toronto? Can you, could she end up with one of the guys? No, not really.
Right.
Yeah.
But Scott got his hands on the script, and he absolutely flipped out for it and just said, I'm going to give you the money.
Scott Rudin, a good
Scott
person
Rudin.
to have on your side, yeah.
An incredible person to have on your side, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because, I read movies for the press, they have production notes. I interviewed her and Saoirse Ronan together, and these were like the best, I told Greta these were the best production notes I've ever seen in a movie. It was like a work of literature, and that she had crafted herself, this self-interview. And, I don't know how many, I hope most of you have seen the film. Now I worry about spoiler, so let me think of how to phrase it. But anyway, she was referencing like Peter's betrayal of Christ before the crucifixion. She's just referencing all these crazy, deep subjects, and for this, again, coming-of-age story, but that has that layer of depth and consideration.
Every detail of the film is purposeful.
Yeah.
And actually fraught with symbolic meaning and resonance. So you experience it as this sort of fun ride, but
Yeah.
it is so carefully layered.
Yeah.
And you sense that.
Yeah. And it was great because Saoirse was just like, she's Irish. I'd love to take the piss out of her. Because she's just like, one day on set, Greta came up to me and she had this quote from Nietzsche, and I was like, yeah, it's a little much, but I get what you're saying, but it's kind of
Well,
fun.
Saoirse's the opposite of Daniel Day-Lewis. She is joking around with the crew and hanging out and being totally normal until you say action,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
it turns on a dime.
Miles Dale, Shape of Water, leading 13 Oscar nominations.
We are?
Congratulations. Your director, Guillermo del Toro, he described the process of making this movie. He said, it was a terrible filmmaking experience.
Well, that's what I was going for.
He mentioned, he said it was very difficult. We crammed $60 to $70 million of budget into a movie that only had $19.5 million. But we wanted it to look enormous, so it demanded huge sacrifices. What were those sacrifices?
Well, we threw virgins in the well every day because he said that's what they did in Mexico. No, I think it's, Guillermo had done some bigger movies, and his appetite is always going to exceed the resources. I think any good director, their aspirations will exceed the budget. So it comes down to, prioritizing. He's a very smart man, and he knew what he wanted. He's got 25 years of experience, where, he knows what it takes. So it came down to just making some, hard decisions, and I don't really think we sacrificed that much, to be perfectly honest. It's all up there. We had to work smart. A few people probably know this, a few of these guys do, but we were shooting a TV show at the time called The Strain, which was also on a Fox network. So the idea that I had was to do it in between seasons of the show. And so we used the stages, and we used a bunch of the crew. Guillermo's a big Hitchcock fan, and I said, this can be like your Psycho, which Hitchcock did between seasons of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and he liked that idea. And so as soon as we finished the third season, we were ready to go with a different art department, and we kind of powered through, and we actually finished shooting. We went a little longer. I mean, it was also 58 days, which, for under 20 million, that's a lot of days. So, we're going to be paying off our student loans for a long time. So there's that too, and we've got to face that music. But we finished shooting the day before, we started prep on the next season of the TV show. So it was all, we had to be smart, and also a lot of the people we had worked with, they knew that this was a real, passion project for all of us, and especially for Guillermo, and they threw down for us, our VisFX guys and our, the guys at Legacy who made the suits. So, we handed out a lot of tax receipts on this one. It was like that. People really, they drank the Kool-Aid, they saw the beauty of the project, and, sometimes, people do it for money, and sometimes they do it for love, and this was the latter.
And was it because of the unusual nature of the story that you guys felt like you had to make it for under $20 million? Because he's...
Well, I don't know. Nobody's going to give $100 million for a movie about a meat cleaning lady falling in love with a fish. This we know. So we did not delude ourselves into thinking that, here we go. We got it, So, yeah, and we really took it to Searchlight first, and they loved it, but, there's certain kind of budget limits there. And Guillermo originally wanted to shoot it in black and white, which, I'm so glad we did, and there's so much nuance in his color palette, and it would have been a tragic error. But they said, okay, black and white, 16 million. Color 19 million, and Guillermo was like, color it is then. So, they had limits, but I have to say and everybody here knows this in some fashion or another, but, when you do it for less, you have more creative freedom, and there's not 100 people breathing down your neck as there is, when it starts to get, 40, 50 million, or God forbid, 100, you're under some pretty hot lights. And I think with something like this, we really had kind of total freedom. And so that was worth something. Yeah. And I think he wanted that. So, he wanted to say, look, I've got this vision. I don't even pretend that everyone may understand it, but I've got it very clearly in my head, down to the last speck of paint, and I just want to be able to execute it. I can convey it to, this team of artists, and, we have a group that, we've worked with pretty tightly over the last many years, so there was a great shorthand, and I think, he just wanted the freedom to be able to do that, and we had that in Searchlight, and we had that at that budget. And, he says this, and at first I thought he was, really having me on, but he says, budget's a state of mind, and I'm like, yeah, that's bullshit. But it really is, and if you calibrate yourself, then you can make it work, and that's what this was.
Yeah, I imagine all of you guys up here, if a director says that line, budget's a state of mind, that's your job to say, no, not necessarily, yeah.
Well, I'm like, show me.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say the freedom of a certain budget gives you. I know, Graham, you were talking about that too, about Three Billboards, and that, you have a movie with Frances McDormand, Woody Harrelson, Sam Rockwell. You feel like it's got a certain weight, a certain scope to it, but yet you don't want a bigger budget, because then that means that the studio interference might be greater.
Completely, yes. I mean, what Miles was saying, and for some of the smaller movies here, there's a level at which everyone's comfortable to leave you to get on with it, and that was our number on Three Billboards. And in terms of working with Martin McDonagh, it's the third film that I've produced with him, and Martin is brilliant, but he's not able to talk to finances and studios. It's not a conversation he wants to engage in particularly. So in a sense, you become the buffer of that relationship, and he needs to be left to do what he wants to do and enabled as well as he can, and that's in a sense my job. So I don't think he wants to spend more money. I think he wants to make the films like, I guess, all these directors. He has a vision of the film, and that's what he wants to make, and in a sense it was my job to enable that to happen as best as possible.
How do you guys find that magic budget number that will give you and your filmmakers creative freedom, but yet give you and your filmmakers enough money to make the movie that your filmmakers want to make?
So sort of, in this one, there's a land grab to a degree, isn't it? You have an idea it might be 13, 14, 15 or 16, and you know that if you can get another $1 or $1.5 million, it's going to be so much better. So you literally go and grab as much as you can, and then you get pushed back, and at some point the line is drawn, and that's what you take away. Interestingly, you talked earlier about the ongoing relationships with producer-director or producer-filmmaker. And this is the third film that Martin and I have done together over 10 years. And there's a process where you just we know each other, and I'm absolutely open about how it's going to be put together and how we're going to do it and what that number's going to be. And I always say to him, we will never look at each other over camera and wonder how we got in this mess. We will absolutely know that we've made these decisions together to hopefully make the best film we can.
Anyone else have any thoughts on arriving at that sort of magic number?
I think he's right. You get what you can. We originally told Scott the budget was 3.5, and we ended up making it for 5 and change. So, which Scott likes to remind me, because we wanted to shoot in California. It was essential that the film be shot here, and. To Graham's point, I think your job as a producer is when the director says, this is the movie that's in my head, you have to figure out how to deliver that for the money you have.
Right. And you shot in California, but you only shot in Sacramento for like a week.
Yes.
Because
there's no crews up there.
Right.
We had to truck everything up.
Yeah, so it's cost factor.
Yes.
You made 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, outside of Missouri, because there's no tax.
Absolutely. Well, I'm based in London, so we'd alluded earlier, if you're trying to get that last little bit of money, it's going to be a tax credit. And I don't know the geography of America particularly well, because I sit at my desk in London, and I literally got a map of the states and tax credits, and Martin was there. I was like, well, try New Mexico, and once you've done that, can you go to Mississippi and have a look at that? Go up to Georgia, maybe North Carolina, and then we'll make a decision. And I sort of crossed them off on the desk in London. And that was the extra 20%. That's what made the film comfortable, that we could make it in that number.
You've made 3 movies with Martin. He sounds like an interesting person in the sense that, like, the screenplay for this was written 8 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And, 8 years ago. And he said, I think the quote that I saw him say was that he had it just like sitting on the floor. It wasn't even in a drawer. It was just like on the floor by his desk or something. He doesn't sound like a person who's necessarily obsessed with work.
He balances films with theatre but life, and life is the biggest bit. And frustratingly for me, he writes brilliant scripts very, very quickly. And then he sort of teases you and goes, what about this one? And you read it and goes, great, let's do it. When Fran McDormand, great, when should we do it? And that was in 2012, I think. And then eventually you can draw him to the process, well, let's make it next year. But he'd like to put it off. But it's something about him as an artist. He's interested in the world, and he's not going to churn movies out. He'll make something special every time he wants to make it. But I'm trying to get him ready for 2019. I was thinking we could start focusing on that.
Right. Keep the momentum going, yeah.
That would be fast.
And he had written this with Frances McDormand in mind, right?
He had, yeah. Martin, for those that don't know, has a huge stage career beforehand. So he's had a number of plays on Broadway and won many awards there and in London. And I think after one of his plays, Fran had come backstage, and being quite front-footed in real life as well as when she plays Mildred Hayes, she had suggested to Martin, why don't you write me a role in a film, I'll do it. And he did write it, and then we sent her the script, and she was like, great, I'm in.
Nice.
The weird bit was we had a little bit of tricksiness, again, which happens on movies, putting this one together for the right date. I'd never met Fran, and I knew she had a reputation for being strong-willed, strong-minded. And I had to let some dates slide because it wasn't kind of ready to go. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up writing a note to her agent, who's actually in this room, Brian Schwartzstrom, saying, could you please forward this note to Fran? It was like, dear Fran, my name is Graham. We have never met. I'm sorry. We will make the film next year.
Wow. Gary Oldman was here last night, Lisa. And yes, that was a really nice evening. When you heard that he was, in mind to play Winston Churchill, what did you think?
Well, the way it really happened was I had produced Theory of Everything with Anthony McCartan, the writer, same writer for Darkest Hour, and when we were wrapping that, he had said, what about this idea I have about Churchill? And I hadn't known that story at all. I hadn't known about the UK coming that close to potentially, capitulating or signing a peace treaty. And so I thought that was fascinating. And then we were already at Working Title, which is the production company in England that had supported us and made Theory of Everything with us. So it was very easy to hand it to Eric Fellner, and Eric and Anthony and I sort of sat in a room, and just the immediate thing you think of is if you are going to make a movie like that, focused on an icon like that, the biggest question, honestly, even more than the director, was who was going to play him. And so of course you have a short list because there are a number of wonderful actors, but Gary was really the only one that we ever wanted, that anybody ever wanted. And so that dialogue then started with Gary's manager, Douglas Urbanski, and it went back and forth. And they had a project that they were playing with that was also a Churchill story. And Gary, as he may have described last night, he spent quite a long time resisting ever playing. He was never going to play Churchill. Why would he play Churchill? He doesn't look anything like him. It doesn't make any sense. And he had spent enough time, I think, resisting it that he had finally come to the place of starting to accept the idea. And I don't really think we would have made this movie if he hadn't said yes. There's just so few actors. I mean, what people would say about a role like this, same thing they said honestly about someone playing Stephen Hawking, was you need the Daniel Day-Lewis. They always say that. It's like, okay, so if it's not going to, Daniel's probably too tall for Churchill and too skinny, it just is. So there's just that handful of actors, and they often, unfortunately, for we Yankees in America, they often seem to be British-born, and that is because there's such theater support there. They can play and learn and study and work as actors. And in America, we have much more of the system of, you're 17 and you're good looking and you take all your money together and you move out to LA and you just try to get a commercial or a job. And so you don't have that same consistent training that they have. And so I think, Gary was just a master. So it made that film possible.
And, it's interesting because, like Emma was saying, everyone in England knows the story of Dunkirk. I don't think that evacuation in the United States is as well known. And certainly in Darkest Hour, you see this story of people clamoring for Churchill to make peace with Hitler, which seems insane 70, 80 years on. But it seemed logical at the time. There were very reasonable people arguing for it with very strong arguments, which you put across in the film quite well. Was that an important part of the movie?
Yeah, you know, I think, I mean, Anthony is an incredibly unique writer in that he frames something up with a very specific timeline, and it's usually a very, very brief period. And so it's really only a 3.5 week period of that movie. And he had gone and looked at the records, and that was things that were said by the parliament, because they were up against, Hitler had 5 million in his troops, 5 million person army, and at the time the UK was looking at about 300,000 were their troops. So the concept that they could beat Hitler, it was pretty wacky. It was pretty out of bounds. And the actor that plays Halifax in our movie, Stephen Delane, who's underrated and amazing actor, he's not so much the nemesis as he is the antagonist in the film, but it's quite logical, I think.
Right.
And Joe sort of always conceived of this movie as this thriller, and he directed it, and they cut it very much like a ticking talk thriller. And if you sort of think about it in this way, it's like we're the opposite of, as you were saying, that Dunkirk is almost a silent film, which I think is what's so beautiful about it. We're obviously the opposite, and we're probably the most talky film ever. And it's like a ticking talk thriller, and the words are like the bullets. So,
Is that, I mean, and again, this movie demands a certain scope to it, even with all the talking. It's not something you want to make for like $5 million. Right. What were the challenges in finding financing for this film, which is, by the way, a huge, or a very nice box office hit right now?
yeah, it's wonderful to make a movie like this, which is basically men in rooms talking, if you've seen it, and to have it cross 100 million worldwide just recently, and so it's just great. Like most of these movies up here, all of these movies actually are doing really well, and they're doing really well for what they were made for, and they all have substance, and they're all about something, and at their core they all have really strong characters and canvas, and I think that's just encouraging for all of us filmmakers and all the filmmakers out there that you can continue to make these. But our challenge was, I don't even think if we had gone around and tried to pitch this even 6 or 7 months later than when we did, that we actually would have gotten financing, because the Crown hadn't really been out that much when we were getting the financing together. There hadn't been the little movie called Churchill, so we weren't so Churchill sort of inundated quite then. And if we had waited a little bit more, I think people would have said, nah, we can't do this. And then to still get enough money, as everybody was talking about, and that sort of sweet spot, I think it's like there's always a knee of the curve with budgets. You're trying to sort of get enough to build the framework and have enough support for the story, and then also, as importantly, for the filmmaker. Joe Wright is an incredible visualist. He's not a filmmaker that is loose with the art department, or loose with the look, or loose with how you're going to shoot it. He's almost painterly, and he sees the entire film in his head as you're working through pre-production. It's almost like he's got the flip book in his head. So he knows that he's going to do this shot that's going to take us all day long to pull up when the guy is getting his death sentence and the bomb's going to come down on them. And, we know that's going to be a big, elaborate setup, but that's also part of the reason the movie doesn't feel and doesn't play like a chamber piece. I think it has a lot of scope, so you need enough support for that, but you need to be at a number where you have a chance of them at least breaking even. Because also I think with a lot of the movies up here, they're so strong in the screenplay that there are funders out there that will roll the dice if they just feel like they're definitely going to get out alive, and they don't necessarily expect them to be gigantic box offices. And so there are financial organizations out there that will still do that, and that's what we got. We got that with Working Title and ultimately Universal and Focus Features. So.
Last year we had 10 panelists up here. 5 of them were women. This year, 3 of 8. Is the career path producer an easier one for women in Hollywood in terms of representation, in terms of making a go of it?
Oh, we can all talk to that, but I think it's been easier to be a producer as a woman than it has been to be a director as a woman. Of late, that's been the thing I think that has been the least lacking in a way in having equal representation in these films, because until you have the Greta Gerwigs who write and direct, like so many men that write and direct, and there's so many scripts that are often, even the female characters that we often see in films for the last several decades have been written by men, right? And it's not that they're poorly written, it's just they're not as fully realized as somebody who actually is a woman. And so I think when you have writer-directors that are women and you have directors that are females, you end up with a very just different perspective. Even Wonder Woman, even to me, a big Marvel movie like that felt really different as a female audience member to watch that. I felt like the point of view was very clearly something I don't get to see very often. And I certainly felt that all the way through with Lady Bird. So I think it's changing in that maybe, hopefully, the whole world of media will get a little more open, and I hope also for people of color and also.
I think I would add to that. I think that when you look at the percentage of women in the producing field, it's a much more respectable number versus directors and et cetera, et cetera. And I think in large part it's because of the nature of the job. We're self-starters. We don't have to necessarily be hired by somebody else, where female directors have to be hired. Female writers have to have their story bought. And I think that's where the sort of discriminatory aspect of things has really thrived. And I think that's why there are just more female producers than any other area of the business.
Well, and I think that the lesson of Wonder Woman and Lady Bird and everything in between is that they are distinctly feminine in their perspective, but they are enjoyed by everyone. The myth in male Hollywood is that men don't want to see a women's story. And it's just not true. They're human stories, and they're relatable by everyone. And I think that's the breakthrough of this year.
It's interesting on that point. There's a lot of seeming lip service given to this, but actually I'm encouraged. I was speaking to a studio the other day on a new project, and this was not a public statement. It was like, we have a huge drive for female directors. We want female directors on these films. Give us that list. Let's have that conversation. This, I say, it's not a public conversation. This was an internal conversation. So I think things are changing, and that's only going to be for everyone's benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful too. I don't know how many people in the audience come to these panels every year, because it just feels like I'm always talking about this, and I think I always say I'm hopeful too. And then the next year, the statistics are pretty much the same. I mean, the recent USC Annenberg study, 4.3% of all directors in the top 1,100 films released from 2007 to 2017 were women. That's 4.3%. And I think the figure was better in 2016. It was 6% or so, but women are 50% of the population. And I think, I certainly see that in television, where you're seeing television shows now like Handmaid's Tale, the Ryan Murphy shows, where they are actively making a statement of hiring at least 50% women. Do you, and I know you guys up here on stage, you have a lot of you have specific filmmakers that you work with, and almost solely. But, I mean, but are you hopeful that that number is going to, and how does that number increase?
Well, I can say Sundance, I think this year, isn't it like 40% of the directors were women? That's a brand new. That's
Yeah.
a really big bump up. So it does seem like it, because Sundance is often a precursor, right, to the mainstream industry. So I do really think that it is actually changing now.
Yeah.
I think you've also got a lot of, studio heads are women, a lot of development executives are women. I mean, those ranks are very well represented, and I think it all has to start with awareness, and there's clearly a spotlight on it, and people are talking about it, and I think those are the people who are in the position to make those decisions. I think they're going to start to make those decisions more often, and put female directors on their movies and buy their scripts. It's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the responsibility ultimately does land with sort of financiers. I always get kind of annoyed when people get cross with, like, I don't know, the Academy or whatever, about the fact that they're not rewarding female filmmakers, because they're only as good as the industry that they're reflecting, in a way. And for me, I think that the studios and other independent financiers have to step up and start making these movies. And I do think that, as long as audiences are going to films that are telling diverse stories, whatever they are, then there's an impetus for studios and financiers to make those stories, because there is an audience there. And some of my favorite filmmakers and some of my favorite films have been those that tell female stories. And I have to say, Lady Bird, the idea that, I so rarely get to see a film where I see me, and I'm afraid to say I do see myself as Laurie Metcalf.
I was going to say,
I have a 16-year-old daughter, so and Wonder Woman, seeing women who are middle-aged but kicking ass, all the Amazons. We have as audiences, in a way, have to also reward those films that do show us and tell our stories, and that way there's an impetus to make those films.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I saw the look on your face when we were talking about Lady Bird earlier, and I could tell that it was a movie that had struck a chord with you.
Yeah.
And the Producers Guild, your guild, came out with a series of guidelines last month related to sexual harassment on set. And one of the conclusions of those guidelines was, well, if film sets are more inclusive, if film sets have more women on them, if film sets are more racially diverse, then that's one concrete step to solving issues of set behavior. And because it's not going to, it's representation. It's going to. Do you think that's true? I mean, because the guidelines that the PGA, Producers Guild, came out with basically said the buck stops with producers in terms of set conduct, and I think you guys work with filmmakers who are respectful, certainly, but that's not always the case. I hear from so many women who just say it's really hard for them on movie sets. How can producers do a better job of making women comfortable on sets?
Well, I think it starts so much in pre-production also, though. It starts in the concepts of the stories. I think the bigger answer to that for me is, for so long, female characters, in most of my growing up, the female characters that are represented are often sort of ornamental in a story. They're the wife that says just these few things, and it's always the male character driving the story. And then as a female producer, I'm sure this is true for some other gals up here, it's just, you're in the casting moment, and you're talking about, you've cast Harrison Ford. And then the lists that people come up with, even the female casting director, for the romantic interest or the wife of Harrison Ford, it suddenly reads like you're casting a college picture, a high school picture. Like, why are they so much younger?
You're
right?
casting his daughter.
Yeah,
not
that's just the assumption. She should be 20 to 30 years younger, right? And I think like a movie like Three Billboards, were that made in sort of the older school world, Frances McDormand clearly would have been a man. That would have been the man leading that. That's like the Western, right? And instead it's a woman. So I think it's starting also with artists like Martin being able to visualize a story and have the assumption that a woman can have just as many layers and have just as much power as a man. And if it starts there, then when you bring it to the set, you, I think, are already changing the dialogue and the dynamic. I think that's it's sort of a bigger picture idea than that. But yes, on sets, I think there can be a lot of sort of difficult conduct, for sure.
But across the board, I mean, I think that, I think it's, as managers, which is ultimately what we are, it's our responsibility to create a working environment that's safe and respectful of everybody, whether they're, female, male, or whatever. And, I think that obviously hiring more women, I think, is going to be very helpful. And sort of, there's no doubt, the research tells us that the more females, the more women there are in a working environment, the less harassment there is. But, I just think it's something that we all have to work on across the board.
But I think your point is well taken. I think hiring matters, but the stories matter. And regarding women as objects in Hollywood for as long as we have objects of the male gaze, I mean, it's one of the profound pillars of American cinema, has bled into the way women are regarded throughout the business. So it has to change at every level.
But this isn't just the women's issue. I mean, it's for all of us. It's for all of us to take on.
They're afraid to talk about it.
I'll jump in and just say that I am encouraged. I know that the focus is on this, but as a gay man, you alluded to this when you first asked me the question of what was it like when you first came to town and you were living sort of figuratively and literally in a closet, and it's true. I was literally in a closet with the clothes over my head and everything. But I was also an actor who had come to town and was unable to be out about being gay and had to make different choices in my life because of this. And I never dreamed that it would be a day when I'd be married to my husband, who's here, and I'd have children, and a movie that I produced with a gay love story would be Academy Awards, and last year was Moonlight. And so my point being is, and what's encouraging is we get there, we get it. Like especially Hollywood and especially movie makers, like for the most part are good, smart people, and they are being told what's wrong, and we hear it, and little by little, and hopefully quicker and quicker, I am confident that this community who working together will get it right, and you will see a lot more women directors and telling their stories. And because I never dreamed 20 years ago that as a gay man, this is where we'd be and we have more work to do too, still, but we're doing it, and I'm glad about that.
And if I can just add, I think Hollywood is also, in general, it's plenty white. It's too white. And I think that people of color, it seems like, partly because of pedigree television, shows that are on Netflix and Amazon, and that we can get access to that don't have to have an opening big box office, are able to take these chances where they're able to have a whole show with people that are not white. So that's encouraging also, because it's just showing other people in the world, showing us who we are as opposed to just, the people that make the decisions.
So, just job of producer, actors get all the glory, and directors get all the credit. What do producers get?
Migraines.
Get to make another one?
Yeah.
It's a funny job, isn't it? Because producers often work with different directors, and I do, you have a different experience depending on the psychology of the director you're working with. And I find literally you might wrap yourself around someone one day this way, and on a different film you have another version of it. It's like, okay, we're doing that this time.
Sometimes with the same person.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But in a sense, what's the job? The job is to facilitate the very best film. How do we get the very best film made? That means subsuming your ego to the point that the best happens. And it's not about us individually, it's about the film as a whole. And that's what I think probably we all keep in mind.
You actually become what the movie needs you to become, actually, because the director's going to be different. It's like a chemistry project, and all the different things are different. And so you see what all those people are, and you become, it's like Zelig, you need to be what the movie needs you to be to make it as good. So, with a first-time director, you might be very different, where you have to be a little more insistent with your second opinion, or it's a little more babysitting, or with some guy it might be more cheerleading. With guys like Guillermo, you just kind of execute. So really, I think that's part of it. It's an ultimate multitasking job, but really, you're shape-shifting a little bit too, because you're using different parts of your toolkit and your skill set and your personality, and you're cajoling, or you're being firm, or you're parenting, or, you have to be a lot of different people depending on what it is. So that's the job.
And I think for me, the thing that I love about producing, and I work with somebody who's, it's a different situation than many of yours. But the thing that's, to me, brilliant about it is the fact that you're on the film from the very beginning to the very end, and you are in every bit of the process. And for a lot of you, you're on before your directors are. That's not the case with me, but he is also my producing partner and so it sort of works in that way. But there's no one else who has that, I think, on most of these films than the producer, and that's a really special thing, like to really bring a film into being.
Yeah,
And you're the ultimate therapist. Sorry, I think one of the biggest jobs always through every situation is that you're a therapist.
Did you say therapist?
Therapist.
Yes, yeah. And I was going to say, I think also what Miles said, of all those edges, I think parent is like just exactly the parenting in the best way of from the very beginning, and all the different ways you have to parent and be a parent, and the unconditional love of all of it and everything. And then just the experience now that it's out in when the movie finally goes out into the world, and you hope you sort of raised a good citizen, that the world's going to interact with, right, and everything. And then and even when it's out in the world, you still got to deal with the calls at the middle of the night and bailing someone out of jail. But but mostly, I feels to me like the best kind of parenting.
We always have a lot of students here, or some students. What advice would you give them to aspiring producers in the audience?
I think the best bit of advice, depending on what part of the industry you're in, is someone once said to me, work on quality projects with good people, and you'll always work. And I always say to a lot of the like film students and stuff that we'd have on our films, that, you should also enjoy it. It's like, I've been doing it, I don't know, like 30 years, and I still get a huge buzz, sort of excitement about being on a film set. And I think it's something where, it's a bit like talking about what makes you a good producer. I think probably everyone here has sort of a similar makeup a little bit, where it's you want it to be good. You're willing to put up with being given shit sometimes, and it's about moving it forward, and you're working for the director. But I'd say with film students, it's like, if you want to go and work with Quentin Tarantino, he's making a film this fall. Go and see if you get a job on it. Go and see if you could get a job. And a lot of it is, he's just got to get out there and meet people and stay with it. And work hard. Because I do believe this. I think you make your own luck. I think if you work hard, and you can see sometimes in life people that you should stay with, I think that would be my word of advice. Just, that's me.
And work your way up. I mean, it's
Right.
A lot of people coming up these days just I'm going to direct or I'm going to produce, and that's what I am right now, where, start at the bottom. Learn the different jobs. Go work on commercial crews, work on, TV crews, any job that you can get, because you're just going to learn. You can't truly produce until you kind of understand every aspect of the film. And I mean, I was lucky. I just 24 years old, we got our first film made. But I had been in a cubicle watching this guy produce Magnolia at the time. But that was 2 years of getting coffee and then working on production, throwing yourself into it. And you have to work your way up. You have to, in order to understand how difficult it is and what your crew is going through, what your director's going through, what your cast is going through, you have to experience it. The easy way is just to find a great piece of material and slap yourself on as producer, and there you go, and then you can learn after the fact, which is partially what I did. But I mean, we've all had multiple producers on multiple films, and sometimes you never even meet them. I've had films where a guy was following me around for 3 days. I didn't know he was a producer on the film, German tax credit from somewhere. And you never actually know, but how do you produce? I agree with Daniel. It's like, go take those jobs, like the most menial, build your way up. It's the only way to kind of get a broad scope of what you're getting yourself into.
Okay. Anyone else? No? Thank you so much. Congratulations, all Oscar nominees here.